It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. My name is Chris Teutsch. I'm Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center in Princeton, Kentucky. And tonight I'll be talking to you about practical considerations for improving hay quality. I always like to start out and talk about what forage quality is, and we can talk about crude protein, total digestible nutrients, or in vitro true digestibility, but really to me what forage quality is the ability of that forage to produce a desired animal response, whether that's milk in your bulk tank or keeping conditions on a brood cow. This is a really simple concept, but getting to that animal performance can be pretty complex. Um, and what I want you to take away from this slide is that we do our best to estimate what animal performance is going to be, but it's not perfect by any means. I'd like to share with you a data set that was provided to me by Kim Field from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. It included 14,000 hay samples taken over a 10-year period. First thing I did with that sample set was delete what I considered to be outliers from that sample set. And then I grouped the samples by the type of hay they represented. And then we predicted total digestible nutrients using equations from Virginia Tech. And they're acid detergent based equations. And then we calculated summary statistics for the data set. This whole presentation can be seen on the KY Forages YouTube channel. It was given at the Forages at KCA session that was delivered this January. Last thing I want to mention before I give you a synopsis of this presentation was that this sample set is likely skewed towards better hay samples. Why is that? It's because people that take the time to submit their hay samples for forage quality analysis are probably some of your better hay producers, and they're taking the time and the money to take that sample and send it in. And that's going to skew this sample set towards those better samples. The worst hay in Kentucky never gets tested. So this is the results, and this is the percentage of grass and clover samples that are meeting the energy requirements of various animal classes. In samples meeting the requirements, that's the percentage on the x-axis, and these are different animal classes on the y-axis. So what I want to start out with and show you is the percentage of samples that meets the requirements of a dry cow mid-gestation. So this is when her energy requirements are going to be the lowest. And about 80% of the samples submitted would meet the requirements. Now, when she gets to late gestation, that fetus is really growing. About 40% of those samples will meet her requirements. This is kind of where things really fall apart at. So I've got a cow, and she's had a calf, and she's lactating. Only about 12% of those samples is going to meet her energy requirements. And when we talk about growing animals, we just should assume that the hay alone will not meet their energy requirement. They're going to need some form of supplementation. So if I take all these hay samples and I kind of group them into these categories that I made up from really bad to really good hay, what I don't want to do tonight is try to make everybody a really good hay producer, because we're not going to move from really bad to really good. That's not even practical. But if I can move you from really bad to bad, or maybe even to okay hay, then we can make a big impact on your operation, because we're going to, number one, reduce the amount of hay that we need. We're going to keep animals in better condition. We're going to reduce the amount of supplementation that we need, and we're going to improve rebreeding by having better quality hay in our operation. So let's talk about some considerations for improving hay quality. And the first one I want to start out with is soil fertility. And this is Liebig's law of the minimum. And if we think about Liebig's law of the minimum as a barrel, each stave in that barrel represents a different essential plant growth factor. So that's something the plant needs to grow. So whatever the lowest stave is in this barrel is going to limit overall production. If I fill this barrel up with water, I'll never be able to fill it up past the stave, right? If this barrel was 100% full, that would represent 100% yield in our hayfield. If we have a low stave, it's going to limit overall production. And that commonly happens in hayfields. And the most common nutrient that's deficient is potassium, because we remove relatively large quantities of potassium during hay production. I'll show you a chart in a moment. The point I want you to take home from this example of the Liebig's law of the minimum is that we can't pick and choose what nutrients we want to supply in a hay production system. We've got to have a balanced approach to soil fertility. So we need to identify what's limiting and then supply what's limiting in that system. A lot of people will look at plants in their hayfield and say, well, you know, I've got some broom straw in my hayfield, so that means I need lime. Well, maybe, but not always. It could be phosphorus or it could be potash also. The only way to really know is to get a soil sample. And getting a good soil sample is really important because it's going to represent, it needs to be representative of the soil in that field so that we can make a good soil test recommendation. Samples should represent about 20 acres or less. We want to take 15 to 20 cores in a zigzag pattern. We always want to use a soil probe to take samples, and we want to sample at a 4-inch depth. And we want to avoid areas where animals congregate at. So if we fed hay in that hay field or fed supplement or whatever, if animals are hanging out in a certain area of the hay field, don't sample there because they tend to concentrate nutrients in those areas. And that'll give you a false soil test result. And then make sure we do our paperwork when we submit our soil samples. The first thing I want to talk about, the first thing I always look at when I get a soil test report back is pH or soil acidity. And I want to talk a little bit about that because that's a major factor in limiting forage production in the southeastern United States. Whether you're in pastures or hay fields, it limits overall production. It reduces nutrient availability in the soil and it reduces nitrogen fixation in legumes. So this is the impact that soil pH has on the availability of different nutrients. The wider these bands are, the more plant available they are. So if we look at our major nutrients at a low pH, we see that the nutrient availability decreases markedly. If we look at the ideal pH range of 6 to 7, that's when things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium all have the largest plant availability. And that's what we're after. That's why we lime our fields, not just to reduce soil acidity, but also to increase nutrient availability. The reason I'm showing you this chart is that if you get your soil test back and you've got limited funds, you're going to get your best return by supplying lime to that field if the soil test requires lime. Liming neutralizes soil acidity. It also supplies calcium and magnesium. And these are some general guidelines. In most hayfields and pastures in the Commonwealth, we're going to need to be between 6 and 6.4 is going to be our ideal range. If we're growing grass in our alfalfa mixture or just alfalfa, we want to be closer in that 6.5 to 6.8 range. All right, this last slide that I want to show you with soil fertility is focusing on nutrient removal by hay crops. And hay removes a tremendous amount of nutrients. If we look at orchard grass, for example, we remove 50 pounds of nitrogen, 17 pounds of phosphorus, and 60 pounds of potash in every ton of hay. So if we have a good year, we're removing 150 pounds of nitrogen, about 50 pounds of phosphorus, and about 180 pounds of potash per acre if we have a 3-ton yield on orchard grass. The point that I want to make is that we can get away with not replenishing those nutrients for a few years, but over time we're going to draw those nutrient levels down. And most commonly we draw potash down. And as we draw that potash down into that low category, we start to limit overall hay production in that field. And regardless of how much nitrogen we supply, we can't overcome that potash limitation. Again, it's important that we have a balanced approach to soil fertility, and that balanced approach needs to be based on a good soil test. All right, let's change gears a little bit and talk about the single most important factor impacting forage quality, and that's stage of maturity at harvest. This is the single most important factor. If you take 2 things home tonight, if you want to improve hay production and quality on your farm, you need to get a soil test, and you need to cut your hay at the proper growth stage. If we look at the impact of growth stage going from leafy here to full bloom or reproductive here, as we increase that maturity, we tend to decrease things like the amount of leaves in that hay, the amount of protein in that hay, the amount of minerals, and we increase fiber and lignin and the amount of stems. And that has a profound effect on digestibility of that forage. Digestibility decreases, if we look at the digestibility line, it decreases as that plant matures. Dry matter intake also decreases. So the hay is lower in quality and the animals can eat less of it. So it's harder for them to get their nutrient requirements out of that hay. Yield tends to increase. So a lot of times we're shooting for maximum yield. Really, we want to be somewhere in the center where we have decent forage quality and a decent yield. And for most plants, that's going to be grass plants, that's going to be at the late boot to early head stage. So just as that seed head's coming out is when we want to target harvest. If we do that, we're going to greatly improve the forage quality on our farm. So this is the impact of stage of maturity of tall fescue hay on feed quality and animal gain. If we look at crude protein, for example, harvesting at the late boot stage, so when that seed head is just getting ready to come out, we had a crude protein of 14%. If we delayed harvest until that seed was mature on that seed head, we would have a crude protein concentration of 7.5. And this, unfortunately, happens in a lot of springs a lot more than we like to see. And that's why we have crude protein concentrations of 7 to 8% in a lot of the hay samples that we see. Dry matter intake decreased from 13 to 8.6 pounds. So that increased fiber in there is limiting the amount of forage that can move through that animal as that plant becomes mature. Digestibility of that forage decreases from 68% to 56%. And this all impacts animal performance. We decrease average daily gains from 1.4 pounds on these steers to 0.4 pounds. So a whole pound just by when we harvested that hay. So it is absolutely critical if you want to improve hay quality in your farm that you harvest your hay at the proper growth stage. Talk just a little bit about hay preservation. The basic objective is to rapidly reduce moisture in that hay. And the faster we do it, the better. What we're trying to control is microbial growth, and we do that by concentrating the solutes in the cell and getting rid of that moisture. Mold grows above 20% moisture, so if we can get that hay rapidly reduced to less than 20% moisture, we're going to inhibit mold growth in there. When hay bales heat up when we harvest them too wet, we have something called the browning reaction happening. And that's when sugars and protein kind of combine to form a protein complex that's unavailable to the animal. So that protein becomes unavailable in the digestive tract of the animal. We can also have spontaneous combustion that causes hay fires in barns. So let's talk about some best management practices for hay. We want to mow at the correct row stage. That's number one on our list, the single most important factor impacting forage quality. We want to mow early in the day to maximize drying time. In our environment, drying time is more important than sugar concentration when we mow. So we want to make sure that we mow as soon as the dew is off in that morning to maximize that drying time. We want to use a mower conditioner to help condition those stems and let water out of that plant. And we want to leave that mowing swath as wide as possible. That lets sunlight come down upon that swath and cause it to lose moisture at the most rapid rate. We want to rake at 40 to 50% moisture. This reduces leaf loss, which is especially important with legumes like clover and alfalfa. We want to bale at 18 to 20% moisture. If we're using a big square bale, then 16, 17% would be a little bit better than even 18%. And that's going to reduce leaf loss because it's not too dry, but it's dry enough to inhibit mold growth and reduce the chance of fire. And then we want to store that hay under cover if at all possible. I want to talk just a little bit about bale silage, and I think there's some opportunities here. And probably the biggest opportunity with bale silage is that we can cut that hay one day, roll it up the next day, and wrap it. And that fits well in the spring months when we have very poor curing conditions. And basically what's happening is that we're trying to reduce the pH rapidly when we make silage. So we're not preserving it by getting rid of the moisture, but we're preserving it by rapidly reducing pH. And what happens in the ensiling process is that lactic acid bacteria ferment sugars and carbohydrates to acid. And that causes a reduction in the pH. And that acid inhibits plant enzymes and microbes. And silage is essentially stable until we introduce oxygen back into that system. And this is kind of the process. So we make that round bale. There's a little bit of oxygen left in it. It gets used up quickly through respiration, and then we start the anaerobic phase. And in the anaerobic phase, lactic acid bacteria start to increase, and they start to produce lactic acid, and that reduces silage pH. And at some point, we have acidic conditions that are high enough that it actually starts to kill those bacteria off, and we enter what we call the stable phase. And we stay in the stable phase again until we introduce oxygen back into the silo by opening it up. So round bale silage has a lot of advantages, but probably the single biggest advantage is that it allows us to harvest forage in a more timely manner. And remember, that stage of maturity at harvest is absolutely critical. So if we're not waiting for 4 days in a row of no rain, we can get it at the proper growth stage, and that's really going to improve forage quality. The disadvantage is that it's not an ideal ensiling package. We have a very high surface area to volume ratio. That means there's lots of surface area, and if we get a little hole in that plastic wrap on a round bale, we can cause a lot of loss in that bale. So here's some best management practices for round bale silage. And again, it starts out with stage of maturity at harvest. We've got to cut at the correct growth stage. Ensiling something is not some kind of a miracle cure for bad forage quality. If we put garbage into that round bale, we're going to get garbage out of that round bale. We want to use a mower conditioner to enhance wilting and have a wide swath so we get even wilting and fast wilting. We want to make sure that we make a good solid bale. We want to use plastic or untreated sisal twine or net wrap. And we want to, excuse me, make bales a little bit smaller to keep the weight manageable. And then ideally we want to wrap bales where they're going to be stored at so that we don't have to handle them again and risk putting a hole in that plastic. We want to only make enough bales in a day that we can wrap. So we don't want bales to sit around for a long time. We want to wrap them the same day, ideally, that we make them. We want to use a good quality silage wrap designed for bale silage, and we want to make sure that it's UV resistant. We want to put on a minimum of 6 layers. And then if we get any holes, which happens sometimes, we want to patch them with a special tape that's UV resistant. And ideally, we would want to feed silage out by the next season. So if I make bale silage this year, I want to feed it out by this time next year. We don't want to keep it over seasons because, again, it's not the ideal ensiling package compared to a conventional silo. All right, just want to finish up and talk a little bit about hay storage. And I think it's really important to think about how we're storing this hay. We spend a tremendous amount of money on producing hay, and then we leave it outside to rot, and that's not ideal in most cases. So real quick, if we're losing 4 inches on the outside of this bale, if we do the math, that's about 25% of the bale volume. So losing just 4 or 5 or 6 inches on the outside of the bale can be up to a third of that bale volume if we're storing it outside. And that's kind of what this table shows. We have a 5-foot bale, we have 6 inches of loss on the outside, then we're losing about 36% of that bale volume. So that surface of the hay bale makes up a considerable amount of the bale volume. This is some work that Mike Collins did in Lexington a long time ago, and he looked at storing bales on a rock pad versus directly on the ground. And what he found was that when he stored them on a rock pad, he had 10% dry matter losses versus 30% dry matter losses stored on the ground. We often think of moisture coming from the top and getting into the bale, but really most of the moisture is being wicked up from the ground. If we can break that ground contact with the rock pad, we can considerably reduce storage losses. Where we store hay is also important, and storing it in tree lines or along tree lines is not ideal. We want to store it somewhere where it's going to get sunlight and can stay dried out. If we store it outside, we want to put long rows together end to end. We want 3 to 4 feet between rows, and we want the rows to run down a slope so that water can escape and won't get ponded between the rows of bales. In some of Mike's work, he looked at net wrap on the ground versus twine on the ground, and the net wrap had a little bit lower losses, but not as much as you would think. 23% dry matter loss versus 30% dry matter loss for twine on the ground. What really reduced dry matter losses for outside storage was when we wrapped the bales with plastic. So this was, I think, done with an M&W baler. And it actually, instead of twine or net wrap, it used a silage film. That really reduced dry matter losses because it broke the ground contact of that bale. And it was very similar to a conventional shed. If we stack hay, we've got to cover it. And if we do a good job of breaking ground contact and covering the hay, we can have pretty low dry matter losses when we tarp hay. But it's a lot of work. The best way to store hay, of course, is in some kind of a barn. So if you have structures on your farm, fill those up first and then save the worst hay for storing outside. All right, I want to go now and talk a little bit about hay sampling. I think it's important that if we're going to try to improve hay quality that we measure it so that we can see if we're making progress or not. And so the goal of any hay sampling program should be to get a sample that represents the hay that you're feeding your animals. And that means that we need to sample each hay lot separately. And a hay lot is one single field and a single cutting. So for example, I got field A, first cutting, that's one hay lot. Field A, second cutting, that's 2 hay lots. Field B, first cutting, that's a third hay lot. So we want to sample each hay lot separately. We always want to use a properly maintained hay probe. So pulling a grab sample out of that bale with your hand is not adequate. You need to use a hay probe. By properly maintained, I mean a sharp hay probe that cuts through the bale and doesn't push through the bale, but cuts through the material in the bale. And if you're sampling hay that's stored outside, you'll want to pull that weathered layer away because that represents refusal by the animals, and sample what's below that. The probe length should be about 18 inches. We're going to collect about 20 cores per hay lot. We sample round bales from the side and square bales, whether they're big or small, from the ends. And then we want to submit that entire sample to the lab in a clearly marked plastic bag. We do not want to try to separate this sample. If I reach in this plastic bag and I pull part of that sample out, I'm pulling the large pieces out. I'm leaving these fines at the bottom of this sample. And that's where all the nutrition is in the fines. So we're going to get a lower quality hay test result because we did not submit the fines. Let them grind that entire sample. Once they have the particle size uniform, they can separate it into a smaller sample for quality analysis. We have a brand new hay sampling publication, AGR 257. You can get it at your local extension office or download it online. We also have a new hay testing video that's available on our KY Forage's YouTube channel. Last thing I want to mention about hay is I always think it's a good idea to weigh your hay so you have an idea of how heavy those bales are. Helps with your feeding plan. It helps with knowing how much forage or how many hay bales you're going to need. And if you're buying or selling hay, it's important to know the weight also. Last thing I want to mention is that the most efficient forage harvesting system is still the animal. So anything we can do to extend grazing and reduce the amount of conserved forage that we need to feed is going to be good for our bottom line. All right, thank you for your attention.